Welcome to a special edition on Sailing Sarpedon. This is going to be battery upgrades, part 1.
Hello friends. So today's about power. We are having all sorts of power issues. The camera battery is about 50%, the microphones are about 10%, and the boat's at about 72%. For 2 o'clock in the afternoon, that's not that great. So this next project's going to be working on addressing the power issues.
So in this 3-part battery series, first we're going to look at how we got here, why we chose the path we chose to get out of here, and part 2 will deal with the installation of the actual batteries. Part 3, we're going to look at some of our battery monitoring, charging, and phase 2 upgrades, and then eventually there will be a 4th video when we install the phase 2 equipment. So let's first look at why is battery important on a boat. One of the cool things about being a digital nomad is that you get to take your house with you. One of the challenges of being a digital nomad is you get to take your house with you. So when we take Sarpedon and sail away from the dock, we're no longer connected to the shore power that provides us the 110 system we get here in the US. That means all of our onboard powered systems are going to have to run off our 12-volt batteries. Some of those systems include things like the bilge pumps. Those maintain the safety and security of the boat by keeping any small leaks or rainwater intrusion out of the bottom of the boat, pumped overboard so that it's not sloshing around, providing instability. Refrigeration. If you're just going out for a day sail or a nice day on the lake, a cooler or an ice chest will do just fine. But to live aboard, you need refrigeration to keep your food safe. Lighting, both interior and exterior. Not only is this good for your safety when you're trying to move around the boat, awesome for if you want to read your book, but it's also required in times of low light or say at nighttime. You have specific exterior lights you have to turn on based upon whether you're sailing or under power so that other boats know where you are and what kind of boat you are. Comfort, such as fans or maybe AC. These can't really be underestimated down here in Florida, especially if you were to get out there on a day where the wind kind of dies down. Having the ability to run a powered fan to help keep your body temperature cool is going to be a super important thing. Pressurized water. So just like we have our own water tanks, we have to have a way to get the water out of those tanks and to the sink to wash our hands or to fill a pot so we can make some food. We can do that with a pressurized water. Navigation equipment. So sure, you've got paper charts and you've got mobile devices, but our primary method of finding our way while we're sailing is going to be using our multifunction displays, our chart plotters. So very important to be able to power those. Communication equipment. This one cannot be underestimated. If you are in trouble, your VHF radio is one of the most important resources you have. That's why we carry a battery-powered one in addition to our base one. And then for us running the YouTube channel, we have camera equipment, editing, and computing as well. So we need to be able to handle all of these different things while we're out in the water. So to meet all of our power needs here on Sarpedon, we actually have 4 battery banks. When we first moved onto the boat, the first battery bank we knew was out of service and was running on the auxiliary. So let's go through those banks and talk about them. The first bank was that one we were sort of talking about in the slide previous, and that's our house bank. That's your primary bank that runs all of your systems. But it's not going to start your battery. You don't want to run a risk that a light left on or a fan running could wear down your starter battery. So you also have a separate bank that is just for the engine. This battery is just for starting the engine, and in our case it also provides a buffer between the alternator and the lithium batteries. Then we also have an auxiliary bank. Here on Sarpedon, our emergency bank is to support the starter bank or the house bank in time of need. It is set so that you can switch it independently over to the starter bank as a backup or over to the house bank as a backup. And for us, this auxiliary bank is also a lead acid battery. And then we have on the very front of the boat our fourth bank. And this one is for the windlass. The windlass is a motorized winch that pulls up the anchor and the chain, which is a significant amount of weight, not something you really want to pull up by hand if you can avoid it. But because of its length from the distance from the back of the boat to where the windlass is, it has to have a battery up front to reduce the amount of wiring needed for it. So before we go much deeper, I do want to go over a few general battery terms that we're going to be using in this video. And I do want to caveat this by saying I am not an expert. This is not something I do professionally. This is not something I've gone to school for. I have read a lot of books. I have watched a lot of videos. I've talked to a lot of experts that are available to me, and tried to condense a lot of different sources into what works best for us. But your mileage may vary. Your experience may be different. These batteries are an emerging technology as well. So in a year or two, some of this information may have changed, may not be exactly the same. I would always encourage you to seek out your own sources when you're ready to tackle a project for yourself. So now let's jump into a couple of those terms we're going to be using. And again, as not an expert, I may not be using these exactly the way you've learned them, but this is sort of the way we're going to be talking about them in this video. Voltage refers to the radiant potential energy in a system. Our system is a 12-volt direct current system. Amp hours. You're going to hear us talking about amp hours. This refers to capacity at a set voltage of maximum amps used in 1 hour before the battery is discharged. So think of it as how much energy is inside that battery. Safe use capacity. This is the percentage that a battery can be discharged safely without causing damage that would reduce serviceability life. Now, there is a little bit of controversy here. We're going to stick mostly to what the manufacturers and most of the testing agencies are saying about the different types, but understand that each battery manufacturer may be slightly different. So don't assume that just because it says this about lithium iron phosphate or lead or AGM or flooded versus sealed, that it's 100% all of them. Always check with the manufacturer and see what the ratings are for the battery you're looking at when you're talking about your plans. So moving forward, we want to talk about some of the differences between lead and lithium iron phosphate, because that's what we're really looking at here on Sarpedon. When we bought Sarpedon, all the batteries were lead, and we really wanted to look at the opportunity that lithium iron phosphate gives with its energy-dense batteries. So let's do a little bit of cross comparisons. With lead batteries, the initial cost is pretty low. These batteries are pretty common, and as far as batteries go, their cost isn't that high. Accessibility is pretty easy. Even here at the marina, I can walk in the door and they actually have a rack of some lead acid batteries sitting right inside the door that you can purchase right that day. As you travel around, these are on the shelf pretty much in every country. So you're going to be able to find a replacement for these pretty easily. Weight, heavy. If you've ever had to change the battery on your car, well, these are the marine grade version of that battery. And that sucker weighs a ton. Well, not an actual ton, but you know what I mean. Safe use capacity. Now this is one of those things where it gets a little squirrely. The general accepted value is 50% your cutoff. There's a lot of people out there whose experience says if you take a lead battery below 70%, you're taking out its life. In our case, we're going to talk about it at the 50% threshold because the batteries we're looking at, that's how the manufacturer rated them. Stability and safety. Lead acid batteries are a relatively safe proven platform, meaning that if you treat them right and you don't abuse them, they actually do pretty good and they're not really too unsafe. They are still full of acid, so don't cut them open, guys. Lifespan. You're going to want to look at what the manufacturer rates it at. In the case of the batteries we were looking at, the average lifespan is about 3 years. Now, let's take a look over on the lithium side. So lithium iron phosphate, the initial cost is going to be 2 to 3 times what that lead acid battery is. Accessibility is much more difficult. Most places I cannot walk into the store and just buy a lithium iron phosphate, especially one that say is the exact same type as what I already have. So accessibility, this is a little difficult. You're going to probably have to have this item shipped to you. And if you're traveling overseas, it's unknown exactly how that's going to work. There's a lot of restrictions on how these things can be shipped. The weight is a lot lighter, typically 2 to 3 times lighter. Safe use capacity. This is where the energy density of the lithium iron phosphate is just amazing. Generally speaking, you can use 95 to 100% of the energy inside that battery between charges without damaging that battery. Now, stability and safety. These batteries are a lot less stable. They have finicky power handling requirements and generally need a BMS for safety. That's a battery management system, and we'll dig into those a lot more later. But the lifespan is estimated to be about 10 years. In case of the batteries we're looking at, they're actually warranted for 10 years. Now this slide is directly from the manufacturer of the battery we purchased. I'm not going to dig too deep into this because I don't really know a whole lot about the lead battery that they were testing on the left side of the screen there. But generally what we kind of want to look at is how the comparison kind of lines up. And in generic terms, this is pretty true for what most people compare lithium to lead experience. So I'm going to take a moment to talk about Sarpedon's house bank. When we purchased Sarpedon, we knew from the survey that the house bank batteries were not functional. The previous owner had revealed that the house bank batteries were swollen and past their serviceability life, and that he was actually using the auxiliary bank as the house bank. So to replace them with what they already had, we would need two 6-volt, 200 amp hour sealed lead acid batteries. The batteries that were in there were not sealed lead, but we would want ones with lower maintenance, and they were a little under 200 amp hours. Now, we talked about Sarpedon being a 12-volt system, so this has to do with how you hook up the batteries. When you connect the batteries in series, negative to positive, positive to negative, it creates a loop that increases the voltage while retaining the capacity. So the two 6-volt batteries, when connected in series, become 12-volt, while maintaining that 200 amp hour rating that they had before. Now these batteries run around $220 each, so it'd be about $440 for the pair. Compared to the lithium iron phosphate battery we were looking at, we get 12 volts and we get 230 amp hours for a purchase price of around $700. Now these are on the lower end for lithium iron phosphate. You've probably seen Van Life and many other sailing tube channels who have been upgrading to lithium over the last few years, going for some of the higher end ones like Battleborn. And while Battleborn is, to my knowledge, one of the best ones out there, it is a little bit outside our budget for this project. So we did dig into some research, looked at some reviews and some testing of these particular batteries, and felt comfortable with using these for what we needed. But since we are adding all of these extra lights and doing major upgrades to the electronics, we knew that just the 200 amp hours were not going to cut it for us. So for us here on Sarpedon, we wanted to put in 4 of the lithium iron phosphate batteries, giving us a battery bank that would be rated around 920 amp hours. We're going to hook these up in parallel so that the voltage stays the same, but we're increase the amperage with each battery. Now, to do the same thing with those golf cart batteries, we would have needed 8 of those 6-volt batteries. And let's do a comparison on how those numbers would have worked out. So with the lithium iron phosphate, our safe use capacity is going to be around 800 plus amp hours, up to that 920. The weight, because they are significantly lighter at 45 pounds each, is 180 pounds for all 4 batteries. The volume, it's pretty comparable from lead to lithium, but the lifespan is 10 years for those lithium iron phosphate. Now the same set of batteries, or the same set of rating in lead, would only give us a safe use capacity of 400 amp hours at 230 pounds of battery. The footprint's about the same, but their lifespan is only 3 years. So that means in that 10-year time span, we're going to have to replace those batteries twice. So our initial cost with the lithium is about $3,000, and our 10-year cost is the same. And our initial cost with the lead acid batteries is right around $1,700, with a 10-year cost of over $5,000. So we're now up to almost twice what the lithium cost. But we still only have 400 amp hours safe use capacity. So in order to get that safe use capacity up to the 800, we really need to double the size of that bank. So now we're talking 16 6-volt batteries wired in parallel and series to get up to a 12-volt, 1600 amp hour lead bank. That gives us a safe use capacity of that 800 amp hours at a whopping 460 pounds. We've got well over double the footprint, and the cost here is over $10,000. So lead really isn't cheaper in the long run. Now, I'm sure there's other ways we could configure this, looking at, say, a 12-volt, 200 amp hour lead battery. I believe they have some GC2s. I'm not sure on all the battery names. But you're still going to have to replace those every 3 years. And you still want to try and get that usable capacity up to that 800. So long term, it really is going to cost a lot more and take up a lot more space and a lot more weight on the boat. Now, I know some of you out there are wanting to talk about the safety, so let's dig into that. Lithium iron phosphate, as we know, is a much more reactive mix. It's much more energy dense than the lead acid. And because of that, it does have a high risk for a reaction initiation event. What those are is something like physical damage. So this could be something like striking the battery with a hammer or a screwdriver, or getting in a car wreck in your electric vehicle. Overcharge. The battery's topped off and it's getting too much energy and it starts overheating. Overcurrent. Sudden rush of current, such as a surge or spike. Short circuit. A sudden crossing of the negative and positive cables, causing an arc inside the battery. High temperature, and over discharge. All of these things can lead to a reaction initiation event, which will cause increased reaction inside the cells of the battery. That increased reaction, as you may remember from chemistry, as the molecules get more active, they create heat generation. That heat generation causes temperature rise. And as the temperature goes up, you get increased reaction. And it becomes a cycle. And if the cycle is not controlled, if there's nothing in there to manage the cycle, then you can end up with what's called thermal runaway. And so that temperature rises exponentially until it all catches fire. This is what led to some of the lithium issues you've heard in the past, such as the Galaxy Note and some electric vehicles, say, after a collision, suddenly having massive fires. This is a danger and this is a risk, and it does need to be mitigated. The mitigation is where the battery management system, or BMS, comes into play. The BMS is a brain or circuit board that helps control the battery. Now, many batteries have them external. You can buy off-the-rack BMSs that will control the battery or the battery bank. In our case, we wanted one that each battery had its own internal, so that each battery is being managed separately, and then when they're connected together, they can talk together. So this battery management system, what it does is when that initiation event happens and these things start to happen and the thermal curve starts to spike up, the battery management system jumps in and just turns the battery off. It literally just breaks the circuit. Now, in the case of everything but fire or physical damage, that's likely going to be enough to allow the battery to start cooling down, and then the BMS can reset. because you're getting that temperature down, you're reducing the reaction, you're reducing the heat generation. Now, in the case of a damaged battery or a onboard fire, those risks are still there, and you do have to be careful and plan for that accordingly. So no system is 100% universally the best for everyone. But I hope maybe some of this has helped you understand why we chose lithium iron phosphate over lead for our house bank, and why we're really excited about this major upgrade to the system for Sarpedon in the future. Got a few more things I do want to show you. So we're going to talk about now about how we got the batteries onto the boat. So as we talked earlier, lithium iron phosphate batteries have a huge advantage over their lead counterparts in that they're lighter, but they're still 45 pounds. And Sarpedon on the hard is sitting about 14 feet above the ground. So as we talked earlier, one of the risks for lithium batteries is damage, being dropped. In fact, the battery boxes had stamped all over them, "Do not drop. Handle with care." And the reason is because if they get dropped, if they get broken, it could spark a fire. Not only is that going to be a bad day, but they're $700 down the drain because you dropped it. So we had to figure out a little bit more creative way to get it up the boat. So using the boom, we rigged a block and tackle system with a cargo net and took the batteries up the side of the boat 2 at a time using the winches. It was interesting because if you remember from physics, if any of you took physics out there, the longer your the greater the number of the pulleys, the less weight you're having to actually lift because each pulley's taking a portion, but the longer your rope gets. So in order for us to use this block and tackle system, it was a whole lot of extra cranking to get that up. It probably took about 10 minutes on the winch just to get it up the side of the boat, but it was definitely worth it to get them up here safely. And it was a lot of fun to experiment with a block and tackle system and the cargo net. We've also used the same setup to get all of the ring equipment up onto the boat and some other heavier items. I could see it coming in handy for quite a few things. So we look forward to keeping this block and tackle system here on the boat. It was a rainy day, so I did have to keep stopping for the rain, but it was a lot of fun. Now, in part 2, we're actually going to go over the actual installation. This was spread out over several weeks, and I'm going to try and condense it down because it's a lot of repetition of things you've seen before, maybe some heat shrink and stuff like that. We probably don't need to dig in as deeply as we did before. So I don't think part 2 is going to be a very long video. But then part 3, we're going to come back around and take a look at some of our battery management and monitoring systems, and then talk about what we're looking at for phase 2 of the electrical system. So earlier in the video, I talked about having multiple sources of information. In addition to books, technical manuals, and websites, one of the biggest ones was right here on YouTube. So I do want to share a few sources of information that I have found very useful and very helpful, and some people that I think you might enjoy as well, especially if you're sort of interested in this kind of information. The first one is Dan from Sailing Uma. Dan and Kika have a fully electric boat that they sort of have been building up from the ground up. In fact, right now they're in a major refit. But this is back when they installed their Battleborn series batteries to run their electric boat. And some really interesting information that Dan sort of shared. It is a few years old, so some of the data is not quite up to what it is now, because there have been some great developments with prismatic batteries. The next one I want to share is Bryan from Sailing Vessel Delos. Bryan is probably one of the original YouTubers, to my understanding, from SailTube, but he just has an amazing plethora of information on sailboat electrical systems. And he goes into talking about his wind generation, solar generation, how his boat's set up. They have a fully electric induction cooktop kitchen, which is really awesome. Something we would definitely probably like to consider down the road. And then the next one is one of the best resources for solar and 12-volt systems out there, in my opinion, on the internet, and that's DIY solar power with Will Prowse. Will is self-taught. He's been doing this for a very long time. Started out as a van lifer, and he just really digs into the information, really digs into the systems, and tells you what he sees. And he tries to do it in a way that most people can understand. I really appreciate everything that he puts into his videos, and I really appreciate the fact that he actually had done teardowns on a couple of batteries made by the same manufacturer that are very similar to what we have here on Sarpedon. I'm also going to put a link into his beginner start here. Basics of electricity you need to know. It's a playlist of videos that sort of runs you through 12-volt systems, kind of understanding how DC and solar and all of that works together. It's a really, really cool kind of playlist. I really appreciate y'all hanging with me. I know this is a little different than our normal videos. If you've enjoyed the content, please remember to leave a like. And we'll be looking to put out part 2 hopefully later this week. I'm not going to push it out to the 2 weeks where we normally try to do a video every 2 weeks. We're going to try and get that video out as soon as possible. I'm almost done with the initial edits on part 2. So I hope to have that ready for you guys later this week. Have a great week. Be kind to yourself. Remember to leave a like and subscribe. And we're so glad to have you on this adventure with us. Bye, guys.